Rick and Morty.
The surprise drop. When an album comes out with absolutely no promotion, marketing, or even an offhand tweet, we can't help but get excited. It's like coming home from a rough day of 4th grade, your coloring worksheet being graded a 1 thumbs down, and then you take a wrong turn on the way home. Where are we going, you wonder? Then, you pull into what you think is heaven, but it's really just the family video to go rent Black Ops 1 on the Xbox 360. Maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration, but it's really exciting to have brand new music from your favorite artist when you had no idea any was coming. Especially nowadays, where it seems like we can know every single movement from an artist. Not knowing when a full project is coming is just pure excitement. With J. Cole dropping Might Delete Later on a random weekend, it got me wanting to look further into surprise albums, some of the best ones, and what makes them so good. Let's take a look at the art of the surprise album. But first, here's a real surprise. Did you know that almost 99% of the people watching these videos aren't subscribed? If you like this video, leave a like, a comment, a subscribe, whatever you got. Anyways, the surprise album is a simple concept, but I think it's perfect in its simplicity. I just love the feeling of opening Spotify to something I never knew was coming. It's like unwrapping that bike during Christmas when you thought it was like a canoe or something. Especially with how rollouts work nowadays, it seems like there are 2 kinds of surprise albums. There's the surprise albums that are only surprises because we don't know when they're gonna drop, and those that we don't even know exist. Like when Cardi finally drops his next project, it won't really be a surprise because we've been led on for years now. It's only a matter of time before he releases his stranglehold on us, right? But then there's a case like Might Delete Later, an album that we had no notice of. These are the truly magical cases. These kinds of surprise drops are getting less and less common now, and I can't even think of another case off the top of my head, but when they do happen, it's just great. The first case of the surprise album was an example of the first type. In 2007, Radiohead's In Rainbows was teased with the knowledge that it would be a pay-what-you-want album, a model that's really died with the streaming age, but it was a cool idea nonetheless. This album was teased with 10 Days of Knowledge, which now seems like is even too much to be considered a surprise album. Then this concept of a surprise album really started to take off in the mid-2010s, with Beyoncé's self-titled album coming out with absolutely no announcements, and it proved to be so successful everyone tried doing it, from Drake to U2. Now, this makes sense for the time. With the advent of social media essentially being a whole new culture in and of itself, dropping a surprise album is a great marketing strategy. It gets people talking about your album simply for the fact that they didn't expect it. It doesn't matter how good the album is. It's almost like an interesting psychological trick to bypass criticism. Like the mindset is, well, this album kind of sucked, but it was like bonus music, so we should just be happy we got it. It's like when you get an extra chicken nugget, but it was like a Burger King chicken nugget. Like, well, I guess I should just be grateful for this thing. But honestly, the good thing is the majority of surprise albums have been really good, even in retrospect. And depending on your definition of surprise albums, some of the best albums of their respective years have been surprises, like Channel Orange, which dropped a week before it was supposed to, or To Pimp a Butterfly, which also dropped early after a mistake by the label. Maybe even Endless could be considered a surprise album. I wish I knew more about that album. However, I think this is for a reason that may be seen as a negative for surprise albums. Its biggest drawback is that it's really only viable for the biggest names in the industry, mainly because there's no hype around a surprise if there's no one to talk about it. Even artists with large fan bases but aren't on that A-list level can fall victim to this. 3:15:20 from Childish Gambino, with its complete surprise, no song titles, and no album cover, really came and went. It also broke that psychological barrier, and I don't think that album is looked back on too well. But this is also a result of the surprise album really dying out as a trend at that point. After everyone and their mother was doing it, from Beyoncé's release in 2013 to around 2016, I think labels began to value the concept of a rollout, which is a whole nother video topic, more than they did the buzz behind a surprise album. Surprise is temporary, and stringing your fan base along for 3 years is forever. However, I think that's underestimating just how massive of a trend these surprise albums were. I mentioned U2 earlier, but surprise albums were such a big thing. They surprised everyone in 2014 by taking it up a notch. Instead of surprising fans, they thought, why don't we just force them to have the music? That way, it's like 12 free chicken nuggets. They put their album on every single iPhone that had an Apple Music account, making it the ultimate surprise. Now, this was back in the time where you had to buy those albums for $8.99, which coincidentally is probably the same price of a 12-piece nugget at this point. So this would be a good thing, right? Unfortunately, this didn't go as well as they thought, and Apple customers were not happy about 4 Irish dudes appearing in their phone, and this approach wasn't really ever tried again. But ever since this trend died out, it makes it so much more special when a surprise album does happen. Usually if we get a surprise, it's just a single. It's a nice compromise, but it's not the same. I want a full surprise album. There's nothing more exciting, especially since we don't get many anymore. However, maybe this trend should be dying out, because sometimes these albums can be pretty inconsistent. Love 'em or hate 'em, the 2 Taylor Swift albums that surprise dropped in 2020, Folklore and Evermore, were really some of her best work, and that's coming from a non-Taylor fan. Her leaning into softer alt-rock, even indie sounds, worked much better than whatever she usually does. They were also definitely the most notable surprise drops from recent times in the wider music scene, but were generally pretty good. However, some of the other surprise drops we've gotten recently have been a little weird. Drake's Honestly Nevermind was a complete surprise, but it still had fans disappointed. Personally, I think that album is a little bit overhated. I don't really think it's that good either. Also, Eminem's 2 most recent albums were considered surprised albums, Kamikaze and Music to Be Murdered By, and both these albums were pretty rough. So what are some of the best surprise albums of all time? What's a talk about surprise albums without a mention of If You're Reading This? This is in heavy debate for Drake's best album, and it was a complete surprise. Literally the only knowledge that we had on this mixtape came 3 months before it dropped from DeMar DeRozan of all people. Drake sounded so hungry here, and I think it being a surprise helps feed into that energy. It's easily a top 3 Drake project, with some of his best songs, and maybe his best song ever with Jungle. Absolute banger of a surprise. Die Lit is kind of a surprise album. It did have a single released, but it was announced only 1 day before it dropped, so I think it does count. You guys don't know just how much I ride this album. This is one of my favorite albums of all time. Literally on the same pedestal as like Bob Dylan or D'Angelo. I'm not even playing. I just had to delete an entire paragraph from this script, so I didn't talk about Die Lit for too long. So for this to be a surprise album is absolutely insane. Speaking of D'Angelo, an underrated surprise album is his album Black Messiah. After a 14-year gap from his last project, saying this album was a surprise would be an understatement. It just so happens to be one of the most interesting blends of funk, soul, jazz, neo-soul. I mean, just giving it a genre is a disservice to the record. It was a fantastic direction, and I hope that D'Angelo and the band behind him come together for another record sometime within my lifetime. Finally, let's talk about J. Cole's surprise album. I mean, it's why I wrote this video in the first place. Personally, I don't think it's Cole's best work, and honestly, it might have been his worst. A lot of the bars got pretty corny on here. I mean, starting out the album with a Rick and Morty reference within the first 2 lines is crazy. I think the highlight on this record was his flow. He tried a lot of different things on this record, like on HYB or Stealth Mode, and I think those moments, at least the flows of them, kind of paid off pretty well. 7 Minute Drill was a little bit underwhelming, but I do think it was kind of fun. I don't think his bars were exactly killer, but they were fun, constant jabs. As I write this video, I'm still kind of seeing the fallout from this album. It's hard to see a consistent opinion on this thing, so this is really just my own thoughts, especially when referring to the diss on 7 Minute Drill. I'm really still waiting for a knockout punch from either side though, and I think that when that happens, the community will have a lot to talk about. My least favorite part of this surprise drop though was the production. I really think the beats were a bit weak, with the highlight being both halves of 7 Minute Drill. It made a lot of those tracks where J. Cole wasn't really doing anything kind of feel a bit forgettable, but I'll give it some more time and see where it goes. Also, I can't be the only one who thinks that album cover is a little whack, right? Honestly though, even though this was a surprise, I found myself kind of being a little disappointed by the record. I'm not the biggest J. Cole fan in the world, but I did really like his last album, so it's definitely got me looking forward to his actual projects coming up. This was a good taste for die-hard fans, but for me, I don't think so. Well, that's all I got about surprise drops. I just wanted to give my takes, take a bit of a look at them, and why we like them so much. I hope Cole can kind of start a renaissance of surprise drops in hip-hop, because I think that music is simply more fun when we don't know what to expect. Thank you for watching.